Merry Christmas.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Clement C, and I understand you would like me to read my poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas. Now, most of you know this poem as 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. Well, that's not the title I gave to it. That came later. But I did write the poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas, which is the one I shall read this afternoon. Now, I have to say, I am somewhat embarrassed because, well, let me see. I think I'm getting ahead of myself here. Instead, why don't I start by telling you a little bit about me. I was born in 1779, a mere 3 years after we signed the Declaration of Independence, and still in the middle of the Revolutionary War. I was born in Chelsea, which is now a neighborhood in New York City. Some of you may have been there. But back then it was a rural area because New York City really was only the southern tip of the island, and Chelsea was an estate that my mother had inherited. I was born as an only child, raised in Chelsea at this estate, and then I married Catherine Elizabeth Taylor. Now my father, he was the Episcopal Bishop of the state of New York. He was also president of what we call then Columbia College. It's now Columbia University. Now, before I was born, Columbia University was called King's College. But we took care of that when we had this little thing called the Revolutionary War. I married Catherine Elizabeth Taylor, wonderful wife. We had 9 children, but like was the case for many people back then, not all of them survived. 2 of my daughters died young, little Emily and little Charity. They died at age 6 and age 14. Still makes me sad to this day, and I really would like to devote what I'm doing today to all of my children, but especially little Charity and little Emily. My career was a professor. I was a professor of Oriental and Greek Studies at the Episcopal General Seminary, which was located right there in Chelsea. It was actually built on our estate. And it's still there to this day. And it's still a working seminary. Now, you might think, well, Oriental and Greek Studies, that sounds like, if you think of Oriental today, it's not quite that, it's not quite the same back then. We viewed Oriental as meaning the Middle East all the way to the Far East, and my studies focused on biblical issues, language issues, literature issues, in much of the Middle East. I wrote many scholarly works. I also wrote a lexicon on the Hebrew language. Now that's like a dictionary. I wrote it when I was age 30. And then I also wrote political commentaries. I was quite proud of these. And I was quite well known at the time for one of them in this pamphlet. It was a commentary on our president, Thomas Jefferson. He was running for re-election. And let me tell you the name of my political commentary. Observations upon certain passages in Mr. Jefferson's Notes on Virginia, which appear to have a tendency to subvert religion and establish a false philosophy. Now, in the middle of this scholarly work, I did write this poem for my children, and in fact read it to them many times. I had it published in the Troy Sentinel. They published it for me, but anonymously, and there was a reason for that. I really didn't want to have something like this poem associated with my scholarly work. I wanted to be known for my scholarly work, as I was at the time, and wanted to remain anonymous. However, my children convinced me that I should publish an anthology of my poems, and so 40 years later, this one was published, it was actually published anonymously in 1822. 40 years later, I published an anthology of my poems, and this was in that anthology, and that's when it became known that I was the author. Now let's get to that embarrassment. The fact is, I considered this poem, as much fun as it was for my children, to be quite frivolous. And I really didn't think it would be fitting for me to have a poem out there when I was doing all this great scholarly work that I was so well known for on these political commentaries, and it was quite embarrassing to me. But I must say, I've gotten over that. I've gotten over it for a couple of reasons. One is I've seen how this story has shaped the view of Santa, of old Saint Nick, for children all around the world. In fact, it was published around the world during my lifetime and became very well known. And so it's just a delight to me to see how we have our impressions of Christmas now and old Saint Nick that come from this poem. The other reason I've come around is when I think back to reading this poem to my children, especially dear Emily and dear Charity, it does warm my heart. And so I don't mind at all reading it to you this afternoon, but I do want to give you two tidbits. One is, you may have heard that there's a controversy about whether I'm really the author of this poem. In fact, there have been a number of studies done that have claimed to show that the author may well have been a gentleman named Livingston, who was a contemporary of mine. Well, I've just got one thing to say about these studies. Poppycock. After all, is Livingston here reading this to you? No, I'm here reading it to you. And that's, I think, proof enough that I was the author. The second little tidbit is about the reindeer, Santa's reindeer. You'll notice that two of the reindeer are named Donder and Blixen. Now, that's not how you know them. You know them as Donner and And that's because the publishers, for some reason, the editors, when I had this published, they decided they didn't like my names and wanted to change them. Now, I think they thought that I didn't know my Dutch, because as you know, this book is rooted in the Dutch tradition, or they just didn't like the sound and decided it should have a more German sound instead of a more Dutch sound. Well, for whatever the reason, I'm going to be reading you the version that I wrote when the reindeer were named Donder and Blixen. 'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in hopes that St. Nicholas soon would be there. The children were nestled all snug in their beds, with visions of sugar plums danced in their heads, and Mama in her kerchief and I in my cap had just settled our brains for a long winter's nap. When out on the lawn there arose such a clatter, I sprang from my bed to see what was the matter. Away to the window I flew like a flash, tore open the shutters and threw up the sash. The moon on the breast of the new fallen snow gave the luster of midday to objects below, when what to my wondering eyes should appear but a miniature sleigh and 8 tiny reindeer. With a little old driver so lively and quick, I knew in a moment it must be St. Nick. More rapid than eagles his coursers they came, and he whistled and shouted and called them by name. Now Dasher, now Dancer, now Prancer and Vixen, on Comet, on Cupid, and Dunder and Blixen, to the top of the porch, to the top of the wall, now dash away, dash away, dash away, all. As dry leaves before the hurricane fly, when they meet with an obstacle, mount to the sky. So up to the housetop the coursers they flew, with the sleigh full of toys and St. Nicholas too. And then in a twinkling I heard on the roof the prancing and pawing of each little hoof. And I drew in my head and was turning around, and down the chimney St. Nicholas came with a bound. He was dressed all in fur from his head to his foot, and his clothes were all tarnished with ashes and soot. A bundle of toys was flung on his back, and he looked like a peddler just opening his pack. His eyes, how they twinkled, his cheeks were like roses, his nose like a cherry, his droll little mouth was drawn up like a bow, and the beard of his chin was as white as the snow. The stump of a pipe he held tight in his teeth, and the smoke, it encircled his head like a wreath. He had a broad face and a little round belly that shook when he laughed like a bowl full of jelly. He was chubby and plump, a right jolly old elf, and I laughed when I saw him in spite of myself. A wink of his eye and a twist of his head soon gave me to know I had nothing to dread. He spoke not a word, but went straight to his work. He filled all the stockings and then turned with a jerk, and laying his finger aside of his nose and giving a nod, up the chimney rose. He sprung to his sleigh, to his team gave a whistle, and away they all flew like the down of a thistle. But I heard him exclaim ere he drove out of sight, "Happy Christmas to all, and to all a good night."
Thank you for coming.